have a special treat. We're going to do some table talks, but the facilitator today, the last time you saw her was at the Christmas program, and she had 2 regular hips, and she was just Paula Houston. Today, she's got a new hip, and she's Dr. Paula Houston.
Thank you, President Tom. First, I want to acknowledge President Tom and our program chair, Hamilton McCullough, for their leadership in bringing this topic of race and race relations to our podium. It is, of course, both very timely, important, and complex. And to begin the program today, we want to do table talks. And in those table talks, we want us to start off by thinking about race and race relations from a very personal perspective, and thinking about the impact that race and race relations have had on us personally. So at your tables, for about the next 7 or 8 minutes, we want you to answer the question, when did you first think about race? When did you first think about race, and what impact did that have on you? We'll then have our mic handlers, Kathy and Laurel, come around and ask a couple of you to just share your thoughts. So please begin your table talks. We'll give you about a 1-minute warning before we're ready to end. Okay, thank you. Hopefully you have had some thoughtful and insightful conversations at your table. We're now going to ask Laurel, our mic handler, to come to any of you who would like to share some of your thoughts. We have time for a couple of thoughts. So if you'd like to share, please raise a hand and Laurel will come around.
Hi. My first experience of race consciousness was when I was about 6 years old, and Seattle had just passed open housing. And my mother took an African-American man who was going to work for my father's company to try to get an apartment on Capitol Hill, which had just opened legal housing to people of color. And she took me and my younger brother to stand with her when she would go with him to try to find an apartment landlord who would rent to him, and specifically so that he would, when he would turn this young man down, had to do so in front of 2 child witnesses. And that made a big impact.
Thank you, Dorothy. Looks like, is that Carolyn Hojaboom over there with her hand? Yes.
Most of you know that I was brought up in the Navy as a military brat. And when I was 16 years old, and I had lived all over the United States and the world, and always in integrated neighborhoods. And when I was 16 years old, my parents bought a home in Orange County, California. And it was bedroom city. My first day at school, I came home and I looked at my parents and I said, why is everybody white in my school? Because I had never been in a school that had not been integrated. And I found it to be a revelation to me, because there was a big difference in my perspective versus a lot of the kids' perspectives who had grown up in this neighborhood and had not been exposed to any integration whatsoever.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Some of us in the military were lucky.
And back to you, President Tom, to introduce our main program.
Thank you, Dr. Houston. Today we are going to examine the state of race relations in Seattle and around the country. Recent events are making headlines and raising difficult questions in our communities. They're not always simple answers, but today we have assembled an outstanding panel that is going to share a variety of perspectives to begin a thoughtful and much-needed dialogue. Our moderator today is Carole Carmichael, and I've just gotten to know her recently, sitting at the table. What an amazing lady. She's going to be a great moderator. She's the assistant managing editor for community engagement at the Seattle Times. She connects journalists to all sectors of our community in search of untold stories to enhance and provide the complete coverage of our community. She has a deep interest in ensuring that communities of color are part of that discussion. Her career in journalism, I haven't been drinking again, I swear. Her career in journalism has taken her to several major cities, including New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia, before making Seattle her home. In addition to her journalistic leadership, it is most appropriate for Carole to be here today representing the Seattle Times, which has a long history of being recognized for its efforts to celebrate diversity and inclusion in its hiring and promotion practices, as well as its ongoing coverage of our diverse Seattle community. Won't you welcome, please, as the moderator today, Carole Carmichael.
Thank you. So, as Tom opened the program, 2014 in America looked like we had been invaded by a foreign power. We saw military action on the streets of Ferguson, Missouri against our American citizens. We read news stories after news stories of another African-American life being taken at gunpoint by those who are charged with serving and protecting our very police. As the medical community proclaimed a public health epidemic, doctors, residents, and healthcare workers in their white coats and blue hospital scrubs laid down in the streets across America, proclaiming that Black lives indeed do matter. And from our youth to our elders, we all took a deeper breath and exclaimed, "I can't breathe." Today, we'd like to bring the complicated issue of the recent events into a conversation on what holds for us here in Seattle. With Seattle Rotary's community of leaders, this is a great place to have a conversation on race relations in Seattle. We have an opportunity in this new year to reflect on all that's occurred over the decades of differences and find some common ground to improve relationships and the quality of life in all our communities. The goal today is to share some insights that you can take back to your workplace, homes, and community engaged in a meaningful conversation. I'd like to introduce the panel. Now, my first task in introducing the panel today was to do what an editor does and just chop the hell out of a bio. So these esteemed guests on the podium here deserve more of an introduction than I'm going to give them, and certainly after the program, please make yourself known to them. But for the time purposes, I had to shorten the tale of each of them. Fabienne Brooks, after more than 26 years of service, retired as chief of the criminal division of King County Sheriff's Office. For a 7-month period from 2012 to 2013, Chief Brooks served the citizens of Seattle as a policy advisor for the mayor of the city of Seattle on community police engagement. She presently operates a consultancy specializing in training and building community partnerships. Lonnie Lusardo is a principal consultant at the Diversity Collaborative, and for the past 23 years, he has conducted cultural competency, management, and leadership training and development for governments, corporations, and nonprofits. Lonnie is nearing completion of a book that profiles women and men who have defected from the hate movement and reveals the difficult decisions members of the hate group face when they can no longer tolerate the extremist neo-Nazi or white supremacist ideology of a group that constantly violates their own core values. Vivian brings almost 20 years of community leadership experience in the private, nonprofit, and public sectors to her role as executive director of the Women's Funding Alliance, which advances leadership and economic opportunity for women and girls in Washington State. Previously, Liz served as a senior manager of global corporate citizenship for the Boeing Company, executive director of Youth Involvement Network, national and field director for Rock the Vote and Transformative Leadership, consultant to our community organizations, including Empower Northwest, Poncho, Aradia Women's Health Center, Seattle Young People's Project, and Washington Women's Foundation. A graduate of Leadership Tomorrow, Liz was honored in 2003 as one of the region's 40 under 40 by the Puget Sound Business Journal. Elmer Dixon brings more than 25 years of experience to his organizational development firm, Executive Diversity Services, where he designs practical, innovative solutions to organizational challenges that increase the cultural competency of executives, managers, and employees. His clients have included United Airlines, Alaska Airlines, the University of California, Davis, United States Gypsum, Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center, the American Red Cross, Mobil Oil, PepsiCo, Catherine T. and John D. MacArthur Foundation, among others. Can you please give a round of applause to the panel? So I'd like to begin by each panelist giving us some background of what you bring to this conversation today through your work in this community. Faye, we'll start with you.
Thank you. And first of all, I'm really pleased to be here. I bring 26 years of experience as a practitioner in law enforcement in this area. I've lived in Seattle since 1971 and have been involved in many different community engagement activities during my career as a law enforcement officer because I felt it was important to engage with community members so that they could see police officers as being human beings. I'm a mother. I'm an African-American woman. I raised a son, and so I have a unique perspective from all of those things on this topic for today.
Thank you.
I could go on.
Okay,
but
but we're going to move
we'll
to
go on.
Lonnie. Okay, Lonnie?
Thank you. I think the things that I bring that have helped me the most is growing up in a racist environment, both family and community, and being raised in very negative language about people who are in any way different than me. That, of course, changed in my adulthood. One of the fun things that I got to do in Seattle in 1995 was serve as the chair of the Police Community Relations Task Force for the City of Seattle. An awesome experience, which was interesting, more interesting than fun. And I may tell you some more details about that later. I'm also the founder of Seattle Race Conference.
Thank you. Liz?
Like Faye, I'm also a mom and a community leader. I lead the Women's Funding Alliance, and in that work, talk a lot, think a lot, research, and talk a lot about what it means for all women to have the opportunity to lead and to thrive in our community, and how that strengthens our communities and our economies as a whole. I grew up mostly in Seattle, and I went to Seattle Public Schools. Every school I went to had a majority kids of color in that school. And my formative experiences, particularly at Franklin High School, when that school was 1/3 white, 1/3 black, and 1/3 Asian, shaped absolutely who I am, the work that I do, and the way I see the community today. So I look forward to talking more about that.
Thank you, Liz. Elmer?
When our moderator introduced us a moment ago, she said in 2014 we saw an invasion of sorts in our communities, and particularly in Ferguson, with the militarization of the police department. In 2010, I spoke to an audience in Lille, France, at a conference on drawing the line between cross-cultural understanding and human rights. And the title of my keynote was From Revolutionary to Interculturalist. At 17 years old, along with my brother and several other people in Seattle, including Larry Gossett, I co-founded the Seattle chapter of the Black Panther Party. And the struggle that I was engaged in with people in my community and in the organization that I became a part of give me a unique and different perspective on race relations in the United States and our struggle for freedom, justice, and liberty that continues today. And I hope to bring some of that insight.
Thank you, Elmer. I'd just like to take a minute in getting ready for today I did what journalists do, and that is to go back and revisit the record and look at Ferguson before or at the time when Michael Brown was actually shot. And I wanted to just share that to set the stage, because the question that was posed to me as a moderator was, can we talk about Seattle and what bodes for Seattle in light of what happened in Ferguson? Ferguson is a community where the poor are the revenue-generating entity in that community. And let me share what I mean by that. In a community of 21,000 residents, the Ferguson Municipal Court in 2013 collected $2.6 million, and it is the city's second largest source of revenue. Here's the ways in which they did this. $12,400 of those dollars was collected for driving from their residents for driving with tinted windows. $4,905 for loud music coming from your car. $287,000 for driving without insurance. $2 for every court visit goes into a police department pot to pay for police training. 33,000 arrest warrants were issued on traffic violations and failure to appear in court and other minor offenses. An estimated 3 warrants for every household. The raising of warrant revenue is interesting. The bench routinely starts hearing cases 30 minutes before the appointed time, so you're already late if your case is due to start at 1 and the hearings begin at 12:30. It even locks the doors as early as 5 minutes after the official hour, hitting defendant to arrive just slightly late with a failure to appear charge. Or you arrive and find yourself with an impossible choice. Skip your court date, $125 for failure to appear, or leave your children unattended in the parking lot. While the law says that non-defendants, a child or another person coming with you, can accompany defendants into the courtroom, a survey by the presiding judge of St. Louis County Circuit Court found that 37% of the courts do not allow it. Your tally for the day, $125 for failure to appear, $2 for the police pot, $50 for the arrest warrant that is issued for not appearing, plus 56 cents per mile driven by the cops who served the warrant. So I turn to the panel now and I say, Chief Brooks, hearing this window of life in Ferguson, does this surprise you that residents and the police were at odds with one another? And what does this bode for Seattle in the relationships and the history that you found when you were working here with the police and the community?
So the first part of the question is, does that surprise me?
Yes.
There's additional information that adds to my not being surprised, and that is the fact that there were 56 officers, I believe, on that department, and only 3 of them were black. However, as we all know, the bulk of the community was African American. So, no, I wasn't surprised with that outcome. How does this bode for the Seattle area? I want to first say I'm not speaking on behalf of Seattle Police Department. I'm not speaking on behalf of the King County Sheriff's Office, but I am speaking on behalf of myself, someone who is a practitioner who has lived and loves this area. Can this happen here? People, it already has happened here. Think about that. In 2002, in Maple Valley, an African-American man was killed by an off-duty white police officer. Do you remember the protest that happened after that and the stopping of traffic on a Friday night on I-5? That's 10 years ago. The situation has changed since then. It's gotten more contentious, more stressful. And so if something like that happened today, I think we can guarantee that something similar to Ferguson may well happen here. The thing to be prepared for, though, is, I was in church on Sunday, and I'm a strong faith person. One of the messages from the pastor was about storms. And he said 3 things, that you are either in a storm, you're getting ready to get in a storm, or you're just coming out of it. And what you need to do if you're in all of those situations is be prepared. So I think as we talk later today, or later on in this discussion, we can talk about some of those things that you can do to prepare for it. Because police officers are under attack. I mean, I get the messages. I see that, in New York City, 2 officers just sitting in a car were killed, ambushed, murdered. Police officers are shot at. That didn't happen that frequently 10 years ago. It's occurring now. So imagine yourself in that job. You take that job because you want to protect people, yet and still, who's protecting you? We're all citizens, and I think it's incumbent on all of us to protect the police officers. But on the other hand, we also need police officers who have integrity, honesty, sensitivity, compassion, and a willingness to understand and a willingness to listen. So it goes both ways, and there's things that need to happen on both sides.
Lonnie, tell us how Seattle has changed. Is it a better place to live and work, to raise children if you're a person of color? Lonnie, Liz, and Elmer, I want you to add to that. Answer that question, please.
Over the 36 years that I've lived in the city, I have recognized changes. Individuals tend to be more sensitive. What I see is a sensitivity when we're together. What I don't see is a sensitivity when we're separated from one another. And it's that kind of dialogue that I want. I want to be a fly on the wall in families when they talk about race issues. Is it any different today than it was years ago? I don't think so. I don't think in the way that many of us expect it. And along the lines of, can this happen in Seattle? I would say, plan on it. The dynamics from our task force report in 1995, we recommended 10 changes for police to improve relations with the 4 communities we were examining: African American community, Hispanic or Latino community, Asian Pacific Island community, and the gay and lesbian community. Of the 10 recommendations, only one has been implemented, and that was to improve police civilian oversight. We need changes.
Please.
So I think is it better is sort of based on your perspective. When we were doing our table talks at our table, Elmer shared the story of his mom looking for work when his family first moved to the Seattle area in the 50s. And it wasn't a good experience. I'll let him share that if he wants to. Where I think things are better is we have additional laws in place around the workplace. We have training that happens in the workplace, and where we are still stuck in some pretty big ways are around the gender wage gap, which remains stagnant and large. The last time cities were examined around their wage gap, Seattle ranked 50th out of the 50 largest metropolitan areas in the country, and we know that it's actually worse for women of color. We know that some of the gaps between women are larger than the gaps between women and men. So we can't go too much further in this conversation without talking also about gender, and without talking about sexual orientation when we think about race relations and are things better or not.
First, I want to applaud and thank the Seattle Rotary for having this conversation. That's one indication that things are at least better in that sense. This conversation would not have happened 40 years ago. So I think when you look at the dilemma around race relations and ask that question, it's much broader than it first appears. I grew up in Madrona, and I live today in Seward Park, which is in the area code or zip code 98118, which is supposed to be, and I believe it is, the most diverse zip code in the United States, probably making it the most diverse zip codes in the world, if not one of the most diverse zip codes. Madrona was like that in 1960 when I moved to that neighborhood. And I grew up with, I was telling this at the table, my 2 best friends were white. I celebrated Hanukkah. I had friends that were Chinese, Japanese. John Bridge, who's here was one of my classmates, and he was just telling me about a friend, Al Sugiyama, who we went to school with. And so our relationship, my relationship with people from all different colors and backgrounds was broad then as it is today. And as I look around and I think about my life in Seattle, I've never known Seattle as what I would call an overt racist society or culture or city. It's not. That doesn't mean that subtle forms of racism did not exist then and still exist today. But when you look at the broader question, one of the programs that we started when I was a member of the Black Panther Party was a free medical clinic, the Sidney Miller Free Medical Clinic, which became the Carolyn Downs Family Medical Center. And we started it in 1969 because the infant mortality rate in the black community was the highest in the nation. If you look at health care and the highest at-risk population for disease and death, it still remains in the black community. And so if you look at the broader question in terms of have things gotten better, if you look at the disparity between income and the broad gap between rich and poor, the broad gap between white and black, things have not gotten a whole lot better, if at all, in those areas, in the areas that matter. So it's not me walking down the street and having some fear of someone calling me the N-word. I never had that fear living in Seattle. I don't have that fear today. I don't have a fear of walking into this room of 90% white folks and having someone look at me strangely or oddly, maybe because I was a Black Panther, but not because I'm black. That's because you don't know the story of the Black Panther Party. But I think in terms of the impact of race on the black community and other communities of color, and the gay and lesbian community, and on women, we still have a long way to go as a society and culture.
So now I'm going to open it to you to ask a few questions before we have to conclude the program. So, Tom?
Skip.
Thank you, Mr. President. I too would like to congratulate Rotary on this discussion. It was absolutely wonderful, and thank you, Carole. Sir, in the end, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense saw its job as policing the police. Is that an effective approach today? Does that get us to where we want to be, or do we need to take another less aggressive approach? Thank you very much.
We actually were organized and had a 10-point program and platform. I had to read 2 hours a day when I first joined the party, so we were very disciplined and organized. Point number 6 of the 10-point program said we want an immediate end to police brutality and murder of black people. And one of the ways, the first ways we went about addressing that was, because of the immediacy of it, was police alert patrols, which were where we patrolled the police armed armed to the hilt when we were patrolling the police officers to stop any form of brutality. No, that's not a tactic that would work today. The other thing that we did, we organized around community control of police, and the thing that we worked hardest on, and we had a very strong effort here in Seattle. I served on the Seattle Church Council of Greater Seattle's Police and Community Task Force Relations. And we were striving for a citizens review board panel that could review incidents like the Ferguson incident, or when someone was harassed or beaten or shot, and then make recommendations for prosecution. There's a similar kind of effort in the Justice Department, and what I think is a solution to look at is taking incidents like Ferguson, like the killing of a civilian, whatever color they are, out of the hands of local authorities so that someone objective can look at the case and make a recommendation as to whether or not the officer should be disciplined in some manner or some way. I think that is much more realistic than the initial approach that we took in 1966.
Hi, Mr. Dixon. I just wanted to follow up on your reference to your time as a Black Panther. I was at Garfield High School and Meany Junior High in the 67 to 73, and you and your brother came into the school and with your giant afros, so handsome, and you started the breakfast program, And unlike Larry Gossett, who stirred everyone up, and if you were white in the school, it was trouble when Larry Gossett was in town. But with you and your brother, were so gentle, and it was such a very positive influence that you had in both of those school environments during a rocky time. So,
Is this on? I wanted to, thank you for that comment. I wanted to share a story that happened at our table when John Bridge dropped by the table, and I jokingly said to him that when I speak to audiences across the globe, John, that I mentioned when we started the Black Student Union at Garfield, in order to get it organized, we had to run it by the principal, who kept denying us the opportunity to have a Black Student Union. And so eventually we ended up calling a school boycott. And the principal thought that only a few black kids would not go to class, and that it would not be a big deal. And when the 8 o'clock bell rang, the hallways were so full, no one went to class, and this is the part of the story that I had wrong, with the exception of the honor students. And I often say, and that was my buddy John Bridge, who probably was in class. And John just told me and reminded me that he went to freedom schools when he was a young man, and he in fact did boycott class. And the thing that is so important about that story is that the principal thought that only a handful of black kids were not going to class, that the white students, the Asian students, the Latino kids would not follow along. But what he did not know is that we grew up with all of those kids. They were all our friends. The white students, the Latino students, the brown, the Asian kids, the Filipino kids, they were all our friends, lived in our neighborhoods. And they all acknowledged and recognized that we needed to have a voice. That tells you something about race relations in Seattle in 1968 when that happened, and what I believe is race relations today in Seattle.
For our last question, Laura Rearman.
Officer, you referenced the abysmal record of African Americans serving on the police force in Ferguson. What is the number here in Seattle, in our region, and what have been the trends so that the diversity is represented in the police force?
Give it a sec. Here.
In 1978, I was the first African American woman who was hired as a deputy with the King County Sheriff's Office. Prior to the mid-'70s, when women were hired, and particularly black women, they were hired as matrons and juvenile detectives. So I was the first person that was hired as a black woman commissioned patrolling officer. There were about 16 black officers, black males, when I came on. At the height of it, and I'm speaking just for the sheriff's office, at the height of it, there were as much as 30-some black males and 10 black women. Today, there are 3 black women and 20-ish black men. So people are retiring. I think one of the issues that happens in jurisdictions is you don't really emphasize recruitment and different ways to recruit. My department is attempting to do a better job at recruiting. But the person who's doing it is a white male. When he goes to do recruiting, he doesn't think about going to churches, places of worship, not church's chicken. He doesn't think about going to churches. He doesn't think about going to the nail salon. He doesn't think about going to the beauty salon. He doesn't think about those things because it's not in his frame of reference. So I think that, and I'm speaking just for the sheriff's office, but I also know in the fire department, it's going down. In the Seattle Police Department, it's going down. Because there's more people coming to the retired cops' coffee than there are active participating police officers sometimes. So I think that there needs to be a revamped, a focused effort to do that. But in this day and age, when you hear what's happening with police, and think about it, most police officers are good people. They do the job, they go out and they search for missing people, they work on Christmas, they do those things because it's in their heart to do. What we hear about are the ones who are less than stellar, right? But that's what the media portrays. And in this technology age, You can hear so much stuff so quick, it's disheartening sometimes. So people aren't thinking about being police officers. However, you can applaud that, but I think they should, because if one person has a good interaction with a police officer, they tell 10 people. That interaction becomes something very positive. If one person has a negative interaction with a police officer and they tell 10 people, you know that telephone game? By the time 15 people have heard it, it's worse than it ever was. So I think we all should do a better job of recruiting and looking at positive interactions. And one of the organizations that I do consulting with, which I enjoy doing, is bringing police and community together so that we can have a common basis from which we can build a bridge to be better and interact better together.
Let's have a big hand for our panel. I was very, very fortunate during the table talk today because these were my table mates. Fascinating discussion. So thank you very much for this program. Hopefully this is the start of an ongoing discussion about race relations and how Rotary can interact with it. So we once again give them a big hand.
Seattle Rotary Online is made possible in part by a grant from First Choice Health, working with the Washington Health Information Collaborative to use technology to bring better health care to patients throughout the Pacific Northwest. First Choice Health.